So, welcome to our lecture on moral development. Let's go ahead and get started. So, this week, since we're talking about moral development, I want you to think back to your own experiences growing up. How or where did you learn to tell right from wrong? What are morals? Like, how would you define it if you had to explain it to someone? Another thing I want you to think about before proceeding with the lecture is think back to the theories we've covered in this class. I know it's been a while, but take a guess at what a psychoanalytic theorist like Freud would say about moral development. What about Erikson? Or what about a behaviorist like Skinner or Bandura's social learning theory? How would he use his own theory to explain how someone develops their moral? So think about that and kind of double check your initial ideas with the slides preceding this one. Okay, let's get started. So while we'll cover much more than these concepts or terminologies, I want to encourage you to keep these in mind in particular and maybe make a list of them as you go through this lecture. Take notes on them and use your own words to explain them. By the end of the lecture, come back, see if you're able to explain it to someone who doesn't have a psychology background, or maybe even give a couple of examples if you could. So, before we get started on rules and intentionality, I want to set the foundation by giving you the definition of moral development. So, moral development is the process of learning to distinguish between right and wrong in accordance to cultural values. So, the emphasis is on cultural values. And later, I'm going to introduce two types of rules to you and see for yourself how that fits in with this definition of moral development. So, the first type of social rule I'm going to talk about is called conventional rules. So, defined by Turiel, these rules are one, arbitrary, socially defined rules that are specific to a particular culture, subculture, group, or setting. Examples of this might be certain elementary schools require students to wear uniforms. This is an example of conventional rules. Or needing to ask permission before you leave the classroom. This is a pretty conventional rules, but you may not see it in all schools around all over the world. So by the age of 7 and 8, children begin to grasp that these rules are arbitrary, they're situational. For instance, they often don't need to ask permission before they leave their own room at home, right? Versus moral rules. These are universal, obligatory rules that reflect the basic principles guaranteeing the rights of others. So again, this is universal, obligatory rules reflect the basic principles that guarantee the rights of others. Can you think about a couple of examples of moral rules? So beyond just following rules and telling us what we're supposed to do, what about the intentionality behind the behaviors? How might children make judgment about the same behavior with different intention? So, for instance, if someone is needing to go to the bathroom and the teacher is just ignoring them, they rush out to go to the bathroom, versus someone who is just, I don't really care, I just want to go out and play on the swings. Their intentions are different, even though their behavior is the same. Would children be able to make different judgment about them? So, from Piaget's perspective, he suggested that young children can't really distinguish between intentional and unintentional rule violation. But is that really the case? Let's look at it further. Several researchers have suggested that children as young as age 4 have some ability to make that distinction between right or intentional versus unintentional rule breaking. Because, like 4-year olds, they might say something like, "It was an accident. I didn't mean to do it," when they're being punished. However, what a lot of research studies have also said is their judgment may be influenced by the outcome. So, an example might be if children are throwing balls, in the backyard or something. My child sees another child trying to throw a ball and maybe hurt their teammate. They might even label that behavior as good if the ball failed to hit their teammates, versus the behavior would be labeled as bad if the ball actually hit their teammates. So a lot of times they judge intentionality by outcomes. So Based on all that we've talked about in the past minute or so, this might suggest children have some inkling about intention and the importance of them, but they might be more cognitively limited in their ability to make judgments, especially at a young age. In the next couple of slides, we'll dissect moral development into three different aspects. So we'll talk about moral emotions, moral behaviors, and moral reasoning. So Freud meets Erikson again. Today the topic is moral emotions. Let's get started with Freud. So Freud's theory is children begin to identify with and learn rules from the same-sex parents in the phallic phase. And really, if you think back to that chapter or that lecture on personality development, he breaks it down to the id, the ego, and the superego. Those are the three structures of personality. And today, moral development, we're going to focus on the superego. And another way to conceptualize superego is to think about this internal judge that lives inside of you, kind of like the good angel in a way. So he further breaks down superego into two parts. The first part is called conscience. This is a list of things that good boys and good girls don't do. So if you disobey your conscience, Freud says this would lead to feelings of guilt. Versus on the other hand, he has suggested if you fail to live up to standards set by your ego's ideal, this leads to feelings of shame. So for Freud, moral development is where children learn to develop morality by obeying rules that are set by these two parts of superego in order to avoid these uncomfortable feelings of guilt and shame. So now if we go beyond Freud and talk about Erik Erikson, he was the one who proposed the psychosocial theory. So if you need a refresher, go back to that. But he goes a step beyond Freud and doesn't just emphasize on that feeling of guilt and shame, but he adds a third component, which is that feeling of pride. And Erik Erikson says children by the age of 6 develop all three of these feelings: pride, guilt, and shame related to their moral development. And he goes beyond Freud to suggest that children learn rules from their parents, but they learn from both their parents through observation and modeling. A couple of other things that, if we're still talking about moral emotions, what research studies have found is the quality of the parent-child relationship really contributes to development of moral emotions. So there were a couple of studies that looked at children who were grown up in an abused setting versus non-abused setting. For the children who were abused, they were more limited in their moral development. And for children who experience shame at a young age, they try to hide it. So in a way, they do know right from wrong. But research has also shown that it is not until age 10 or beyond that they start connect that shame with, oh, I've done something that's morally wrong. So just a couple of things to kind of keep in mind. So for pure behaviorists like Skinner, consequences are what teaches children moral behavior. In other words, you reward the acceptable behavior with praise, the behavior is more likely to happen again. And on the other hand, if you punish the unacceptable behavior, he hopes that this will extinguish the behavior. But let's think about it for a minute. How might punishment interfere with moral development and really just backfire? So think back to your own experiences. Have you ever been punished by your parents or maybe seen it in someone where, at the supermarket maybe where a kid was just yelled at for doing something inappropriate and they might have warranted a little bit of punishment, but they were either so distracted, so emotionally distraught, they probably didn't make that connection between, oh, I did something wrong, therefore I'm being punished right now. So a more effective approach that combines punishment with more reasoned explanation could be if, say, a 7-year-old stole candy from the shop and a parent is there and they found out, they might pull the child aside to tell them in private that it was wrong to steal the candy. You didn't pay for it, it's the store's, stealing is wrong. And the next step, once the child makes that cognitive connection, would be to initiate a behavior to right his wrong, either by apologizing to the cashier or the management of the store, pay for the candy, and then later, if the parents help finance or pay for the candy, find chores at home for the child to do and make up for it financially. So, this way, they actually make that connection between I did something wrong and I need to right my wrong once that happens. So, then the moral behavior gets established that way. A couple of key things to remember about Bandura and social learning theory is he proposes children learn more from model behavior. So, what does that mean? He goes beyond Skinner and says it's not just the punishment or reinforcement that the children experiences themselves, but what they observe in their everyday life from others' behavior and the consequences of that. So they're more likely to imitate rewarded behaviors and avoid behaviors that they see in others that were punished. And they really learn both acceptable and unacceptable behaviors from others around them and model it after them. One interesting thing that I have found was the power of storytelling and how that connects with moral development. Oftentimes, as parents, we're encouraged to read stories to our children, and there's a lot of cognitive, emotional benefits to storytelling. But the added benefit is children also observe what happens in the stories of the characters and what happens to those characters and the consequences of them. So there might be added benefits of how children can learn morality beyond just their everyday kind of real life, so to speak. So finally, we're here to moral reasoning. Moral reasoning is really the process where children or adults make judgment about right and wrong of specific acts. So, kind of the more cognitive piece of it. So we can divide this, according to Piaget, into two stages. So moral realism or moral relativism. So children under the age of 8, they fall into the first category or first stage, which is moral realism. They believe that the rules of the games can't be changed because they came from authority, and they believe that all rules that are violated will result into punishment. Versus when they get older, at around age 8, according to Piaget, they enter moral relativism. So they would start to think that people can agree to change rules if they want to, and they would understand just because we changed the rules today when I'm playing baseball with Adam and Joe, that doesn't necessarily translate to violating the rules or changing the rules in other settings when I play with other boys in my neighborhood. Um, they also believe that all players in the game must follow the same rules. They're better at following rules at this age versus their younger counterparts. They also understand that because you break a rule, you might not get punished if you don't get caught. Another significant kind of cognitive leap in their moral reasoning is they give more weight to intentions rather than consequences. As we've kind of mentioned earlier, young children may understand intentions, but they're not able to think through it as thoroughly as children who are older. So, children who are older give more weight to intentions when they're making moral judgments for themselves and for others. And this is supported by more recent research after Piaget as well. So be sure to pause here and click on the couple of links. If you can't access them on PowerPoint, they are on Blackboard. So be sure to check out those videos. So take a look at this figure. These findings are from Colby and Kohlberg's long term longitudinal studies, where they interviewed a group of boys and asked them about Kohlberg's moral dilemma every few years, starting from age 10 through adulthood. Every few years, they recruited the same group of boys and asked them these questions. So when you look at the different stages, look at stage 1 and 2. This belong again to the pre conventional moral reasoning. These two stages are really dominant in early childhood, elementary school years. And then when you move to stage 3 and 4, this would be entering the conventional moral reasoning stage. This typically emerges in middle adolescence and is still somewhat typical in early adulthood. Post conventional moral reasoning, stage 5 and 6, and you can see stage 6 isn't even on here. Um, this is relatively rare even in adults. So, what is the connection between moral reasoning and cognitive development? So, what researchers have suggested is they're often tied together. So, as children age and develop more cognitively, advance through those stages that Piaget talks about, they also advance in moral reasoning. In particular, they're interested in that idea of egocentrism. So, egocentrism is that cognitive state where individuals only sees the world from his or her perspective without awareness of other people's perspective who might be different from their own. So, they have suggested that the one cognitive development variable that really makes a difference in moral reasoning is that decline in egocentrism. And what's parallel with that is that concept of role taking. So, as you're able to look at the situation from another person's perspective, so essentially the opposite of egocentrism, you're able to take into consideration much more as you're making judgments about a moral dilemma or situation where you're determining right from wrong. So think back to earlier slides when we were talking about the quality of parent-child relationship and how that's really essential to moral development. Kohlberg even goes a step further and says systematic encouragement by parents and teachers are really essential for moral development. So the example would be if a parent is able to express his or her own moral views and break it down at a child's understanding cognitive level, they're more likely to influence a child's moral development. And I think that makes sense when you're able to talk about these issues, one, you're bringing awareness to them, but two, they're meeting the child at the cognitive level that they would be able to comprehend and maybe apply that concept. So, similarly, there's a lot of media portrayal of morally defiant behaviors, especially violent behaviors. Those can negatively influence children's moral behavior, especially when there is no intervention or further dialogue from the outside. So, really, what Kohlberg is saying, having support from the social environment is very important. So, something for you all to think about, since we've talked about moral reasoning and how that's really linked to cognitive abilities, what or how should punishment be administered for those whose cognitive ability might be impaired significantly? Um, for example, for those who may have a mental retardation, if they commit a crime or do something that's morally wrong, should we punish them in the same way? So, this might be a little bit of an ethical issue. So, the second question I want y'all to think about is what qualifies, um, or actually, sorry, what qualities of a parent can make a difference in your personal moral development? How would you parent your own children to develop moral reasonings effectively? Okay. So, other than Kohlberg, there have been other theorists that have proposed different models of moral development. One example would be Nancy Eisenhower and her colleagues looked at moral dilemma beyond just wrongdoings or disobeying the law, as Kohlberg's dilemmas often involved. Instead, they looked at evaluating children's empathy and pro social behavior in response to dilemma that involves self interest and other people's needs. So, let me give you a story for that. A child is walking to a friend's birthday party. He sees another child on his way that has fallen and hurt himself. So, at that point, if he stops to help, he will likely miss the cake and the ice cream at the birthday party. So, he has to make a choice. What preschoolers typically encounter is something that's called hedonistic reasoning. This is where preschoolers use that reasoning where they're concerned with self oriented consequences rather than moral rules. So they might say something like, um, I would help because he'd help me the next time, or I wouldn't help because I'd miss the party. This kind of corresponds with Kohlberg's stage 2, but a lot of that you can see is very self centered orientation of what feels good to me is right rather than what is right. Then gradually they'll move into something that's called needs oriented reasoning, where they would express concern for the other person's needs even if that decision conflicted with his own wishes or desire. This happens more along school age and corresponds with Kohlberg's stage 3. At this stage, a child might say something like, he'd feel better if I help. They're not focusing on them anymore, they're simply responding to the other's need. So, what research has said is that by early adolescence, hedonistic reasoning has virtually disappeared, and really the dominant form of moral reasoning is the needs oriented reasoning. So, what's presented in this figure is the findings from Eisenberg's longitudinal study, where every 2 years she interviewed the same group of children and presented them with those series of dilemma about doing good, such as the example we gave earlier about helping someone who's hurt. Then she analyzed their form of reasoning. As you can see, the red line, which is hedonistic thinking, went down as children aged, whereas needs orientation, that's where children is able to express concern directly to the other person's needs, that tends to go up and stays pretty stable throughout adolescence. Something else to note though, even though we've kind of talked about needs oriented moral reasoning and hedonistic reasoning as if they're two separate things, human beings are much more complex than that. So, really, towards later of adolescence, most young people seem to have developed this internalized, individualized norm that allows them to use either or both reasoning depending on the situation. So, that's just something to kind of keep in mind that it's not necessarily either or. So, lastly, before we wrap up this lecture, let me introduce you to Carol Gilligan. So, she was a researcher who was dissatisfied with Kohlberg's emphasis on justice and fairness as a defining elements of moral development. So, for her, she sees moral development in two orientations. The first one is justice, that Kohlberg focuses on, and the other one is a more caring orientation. So, let's define it a little bit. Justice really emphasizes on the idea of do not treat others unfairly, whereas caring is do not turn away from someone who's in need. And you can see that from the previous examples that I've given. One thing that Carol Gilligan is famous for in terms of her contribution is that gender differences in moral development. She hypothesized that girls are more likely to operate from a caring orientation while boys uses a more justice and fairness orientation. She does say that both girls and boys possesses that justice and caring orientation. She's just highlighting the differences and which gender might lean towards which one due to socialization. So essentially what she's proposing is boys and girls see moral dilemmas differently. However, this really hasn't been backed up in research. Studies in adults have demonstrated and proven Carol Gilligan's hypothesis, but studies with children, adolescents, and college students really has not backed up her theory. So when you kind of think about it, even though Carol Gilligan is really famous in the developmental realm, you've probably heard about her at some point in other psych classes. But really, something to note is that her model feels more like a theory rather than this empirically based, research based, or research proven model. So, really, what some theorists have suggested, it's not really the gender that makes the difference in what reasoning might be used, but rather the nature of the dilemma itself. So, if the nature of the dilemma is more interpersonal, it's likely that both genders will use a more caring orientation. So, this brings us to the end of our lecture for this chapter.
Hopefully, with this video, you're able to get a better sense of what's most important in the chapter. I would still encourage you to go back, read your textbook after this video, either to use as a refresher or a way to kind of test your understanding and provide a context to the content of what we talked about. So, take care, and I will talk to you soon.